Moscow, the heart of Russia's power, is now facing scenes that few thought possible just months ago. Millions of people across Russia are gripped with fear, uncertainty, and outright panic as Ukraine has taken the war beyond the battlefield and into the Russian capital itself. Reports of massive explosions, raging fires, and chaos spreading through Moscow have ignited a wave of disaster that is spreading across the country like wildfire. For years, Moscow projected itself as an impenetrable fortress, shielded from the horrors of the war it unleashed on Ukraine. But now, the unthinkable has happened. Drone strikes, missile attacks, and sabotage missions deep inside Russia have shattered that illusion. Ordinary Russian citizens, once living in denial of the war, are now feeling its consequences in the most direct and terrifying way. The attack that changed everything. It began with a series of nighttime strikes that lit up Moscow's skyline. Explosions echoed across neighborhoods, and flames consumed buildings that many believed untouchable. The attacks, reportedly coordinated by Ukrainian forces and internal resistance networks, left infrastructure crippled. Entire blocks were plunged into darkness as power grids collapsed. The Russian government immediately tried to downplay the severity, issuing statements that everything was under control. But videos leaked by residents told a different story: streets littered with debris, terrified families rushing underground for safety, and firefighters overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. A nation in panic. Within hours, panic spread far beyond Moscow. In St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and other major cities, rumors of incoming attacks sparked mass evacuations. Highways jammed with cars, train stations flooded with passengers, and supermarkets stripped bare as people scrambled to stockpile supplies. Financial markets also reacted violently. The ruble plummeted against the dollar, and investors began pulling assets out of the country. For ordinary Russians, this meant skyrocketing prices for basic goods, worsening an already dire economic situation. The collapse of confidence. Perhaps the most devastating consequence of the strikes wasn't the physical destruction, but the psychological impact. For months, Russian state media portrayed the war as distant, something happening, over there, in Ukraine. Now, Muscovites see firsthand the cost of the Kremlin's aggression. Confidence in President Vladimir Putin's leadership has been shaken. Despite his promises of strength, the sight of Russia's capital engulfed in flames has created an image of weakness that even his most loyal supporters can't ignore. Internal criticism is growing louder, with whispers of betrayal and incompetence spreading among the political elite. Global shockwaves. The international community is also stunned. Western nations, while publicly denying direct involvement, have quietly supported Ukraine's long-range capabilities. The fact that Ukraine can now strike at the very heart of Russia is a geopolitical earthquake. NATO allies are watching closely, knowing that Moscow's instability could have unpredictable consequences for the wider region. Meanwhile, China, India, and other countries that previously maintained a neutral stance are beginning to reconsider their positions. The Kremlin's inability to protect its own capital raises doubts about its power on the global stage. If the strikes on Moscow were the spark, the fallout across Russia is the wildfire. Panic has now spread from the capital to the far reaches of the country, leaving millions unsure of what tomorrow holds. Economic meltdown. The Russian economy, already battered by sanctions, is now facing unprecedented strain. With supply chains disrupted, and investors fleeing, inflation has spiraled out of control. Food shortages are becoming common in smaller towns, and reports of looting are beginning to emerge. Factories are shutting down, unemployment is rising, and families are struggling to make ends meet. What was once seen as a special military operation abroad has now turned into a full-blown domestic crisis. Military chaos. The Russian military, too, is under enormous pressure. While forces remain heavily deployed in Ukraine, the homeland is increasingly vulnerable. Strikes on key airbases, ammunition depots, and command centers have weakened Moscow's ability to respond effectively. Military experts warn that Russia is now fighting a war on two fronts, defending occupied territories in Ukraine while also trying to protect its own borders and cities. This dual burden is stretching its resources to the breaking point. The rise of resistance. Inside Russia, resistance movements are gaining momentum. Sabotage operations on railways, power stations, and communication networks have multiplied. Ordinary Russians, once silent out of fear, are beginning to openly question the war and the government's competence. In some cities, protests have erupted despite the heavy hand of security forces. Mothers of soldiers, grieving from massive battlefield losses, are demanding answers. Calls for peace are spreading like never before. Putin's dilemma. For Vladimir Putin, this is perhaps the most dangerous moment of his political career. His image as a strongman leader, capable of protecting Russia and restoring its greatness, lies in ruins. The strikes on Moscow exposed vulnerabilities he can no longer hide. He faces a stark choice: escalate the war further, risking total destruction, or begin seeking an exit strategy that preserves his grip on power. Either option carries enormous risks. Escalation could trigger wider conflict with NATO, while retreat could unleash domestic fury and potential uprisings. Russia's fracturing future. Beyond the immediate crisis, the strikes on Moscow may mark the beginning of a deeper fracture within Russia itself. Regional leaders, sensing weakness at the center, may start asserting more independence. The possibility of political fragmentation, a once unthinkable scenario, now hangs over the Russian Federation. In Siberia, the Caucasus, and other regions with long histories of tension, separatist sentiments could resurface. If Moscow can't even protect itself, how can it protect far-flung territories thousands of kilometers away? The world watches closely. As flames consume Moscow and panic spreads across Russia, the world stands at a crossroads. Some fear that desperation could push the Kremlin toward reckless decisions, including the use of nuclear weapons. Others see this as the beginning of the end for Putin's rule and possibly the war itself. For Ukraine, the strikes mark a turning point. By bringing the war into the Russian heartland, Kyiv has shifted the psychological balance. No longer is Ukraine merely defending its territory, it is now dictating the terms of the conflict. Conclusion. The unraveling of a giant. What began as a war of aggression against a smaller neighbor has now boomeranged back onto Russia itself. Millions are living in panic, Moscow is burning, and disaster is spreading unchecked across the country. History may remember this moment as the unraveling of a giant, not through foreign invasion, but through the flames of its own hubris. Russia stands at the edge of collapse, and the world waits to see whether it will burn out completely or rise again from the ashes.